Good evening, everyone. I think we're ready to begin. My name is Zach Kais. I'm the art director of the Architectural Association. And before we do begin, can I please remind you to switch off your mobile phones if you have one with you, including yourself, I guess. Tonight's talk is the final talk in the 2010 and 2011 Bedford Press lecture series. And I'm very pleased to invite to present our guest tonight, Jesko Fezer, and introduce his talk, Design, Problem, Reality. So tonight's event will actually be a kind of improvised two-part event. First, Jesko's talk, which will then we'll have a kind of short break after discussion, and then we'll continue in the room towards the back for a book launch of Civic City Cahir 3, Distributed Agency Designs Potentiality by Tom Hollert, and published by Bedford Press. This book is co-edited by Jesko Fezer and Matthias Gorlich, who is also the designer of the book and who will make a short presentation of the book next door. Civic City 3 will be available at a special price of £6. And for the serious book collectors amongst you, the first and second book will also be available for sale next door. Before introducing Jesko, I'd like to just mention the framework of tonight's talk. The 2010 and 11 Bedford Press lecture series reflects upon the own activities of the AA, both as a publisher and as a school, by inviting practitioners really from a kind of myriad of different backgrounds, including art, architecture, exhibition making, and graphic design, to reflect upon the role of publishing within their own practices. Jesko Fezer is a Berlin-based architect whose multifaceted practice negotiates the kind of specialized role of an architect in ways that I think amount to more than just architecture. Jesko's practice also encompasses the roles of publisher, curator, artist, exhibition designer, and bookseller of the thematic bookshop ProQM, notably the second best bookshop in the world, I think. We have one as well at the AA, which he co-founded in 1999. In 2004, he founded the exhibition, the architecture Kooperative, ifau, and Jesko Fezer, through which he realized projects in Munich, Stuttgart, Berlin, Utrecht, Graz, New York, and London at the Showroom, which was actually part of our last lecture by Can Alte, who had an exhibition there recently. Jesko is also co-editor of the political architecture magazine An Architektur, in which he initiated the International Camp for Oppositional Architecture. He's most recently been heading the research program Civic City Design for the Post-Neoliberal City at the Institute for Design Research in Zürich, and in collaboration with Bedford Press, he's published these books related to that program. Jesko has also collaborated with Bedford Press on exhibition projects at the ICA here in London, at the AA, and also at the Wattis Institute for Contemporary Art in San Francisco. He's also contributed to a book called 2020, which we will present later tonight as well. And before I hand it over to Jesko, could I just thank Conrad Schiller for organizing the book launch tonight, as well as Wayne Daly, Phil Clatworthy, and Claire McManus.
Thank you, Zach, for inviting me and for the kind introduction. Thank you, all of you, for coming tonight. I will focus on an architectural or design issue more or less, since we have the opportunity to present Civic City Cahiers later on. It will not be in the focus of my presentation, the issue of publishing or editing. I switched the focus on more or less architectural design, but I have a very broad concept of architecture, which at sometimes also includes publishing, writing, or other kinds of collaborative work. I intend to first explain you this picture. Then I want to read a short statement on the question of the problematic of designing in or with reality. And afterwards, I want to show you a series of 12 working theses accompanied by material of some projects I did in the last few years. Most of them architectural projects, and these theses are part of the collaborative practice I'm working in with the office ifau, Institute for Applied Urbanism in Berlin. We have an architectural partnership for 5 years now, and this thesis material related to the issue of the design problem reality is stemming from this working context. So this picture, it's a picture I've taken a few years ago in front of the flat where we live in Berlin-Wedding, a former working class area, now even more kind of area where unemployed, the right word, unemployed people live. And there's a small square related to the social housing building we live in. It's called Gartenplatz. It has been the last public place, last place for public executions in front of the walls of Berlin. And now and then in the last 2 centuries ago, it became this working area and re-erected after the Second World War. And this place is accompanied by a drugstore, a supermarket, a bakery, a bar called Drop-In, and a shop where you can get cigarettes, magazines, and drinks, alcoholic as well as non-alcoholic drinks. And in this place there are 3 trees, and around these trees all day long people, most of them male, hang around, consume some alcohol, talk, meet, and sometimes it becomes quite noisy. And at the moment I took the photograph, the city officials decided to do something with this place, and they put a kind of stainless steel covering on these concrete blocks where the trees, so here in this area there's a tree, and this is this concrete surrounding of earth for the trees, and they put this stainless steel covering on top of it. And what is specific about this stainless steel covering is that this is a very sharp 3 millimeter, very strong upper edge. And it makes it really hard to sit there any longer, or longer than a few minutes. And so people use this kind of cardboard pieces from the supermarket next to this place to make it a little bit more comfortable to sit there whole day long. Maybe this is not a very exciting example of architectural or urbanist intervention in a situation. Maybe it happens different places and with different outcomes. But it is in the end a kind of a design approach to solve a problem of noise, a problem of people gathering, and to solve it with a architectural detail. And it worked for a few days, and it didn't work that well, but this is an approach to relate to reality. Architecture faces many dilemmas. Its probably most serious one is architecture's inherent inability to effectively deal with reality. It lost touch with the everyday and its politics. But if you define architecture as a problem-solving strategy, which is of course quite problematic, but for me at the moment a likable modernist definition of architecture or design. So if you define architecture as a problem-solving strategy, then reality is the field which proposes these problems and where they are to be negotiated. Every engagement with reality is confronted, so I would say it like this, is confronted with at least 3 kinds of conflicting realities. I will try to explain what kind of realities I mean with this. A little bit problematic to talk about reality. In German we have 2 words for it. It's Realität, and the other word is Wirklichkeit. Wirklichkeit is more interesting because it comes from wirken, and wirken means to affect. And it has more to do with the things that affect us, or affect society, or affect the situation, and it's more processual idea of reality. And in German, the word reality is more ideal construction of what we imagine to be real, the world or the situation. And I refer more to the idea of the collection of things that affect us, and with the process of establishing a reality that we live in. So, and I have the idea that there are at least 3 ideas of reality, and I will introduce in these very briefly, and then come to a kind of conclusion for design problems. First, there's the broad realm of complicated facts and circumstances, of course, of objective and subjective conditions, shortly, of social actualities. Unfortunately, they are hard to explore and will ever stay extremely vague. The actualities are not only confusing complex in their structural interdependencies, but they are also in permanent change, and they depend strongly on contradictory interpretations. Secondly, one can identify a field of values, intentions, and conceptions of social desires. These desires are dubious too. Just as the facts and actualities, they are socially constructed and very ephemeral. We can predict little of their character unless that they stand in a complex and probably quite conflictual relation to the actualities mentioned before. Referring to Henri Lefebvre's triadic model of space, a third dimension of reality could be seen in the social practices through which it is produced. These practices happen all the time in different dimensions by different actors with different approaches. They are reactions or adaptations to actually existing situations, and also movements of an approximation to desires. The confusing multitude of parallel social practices in form of appropriation, changes, interventions, projections, and protests take place inside the conflicting relation between actualities and desires, the 2 dimensions mentioned before. It permanently transforms this setting and gives unpredictable movement to it without solving any of its antagonisms. The first reality, the actualities, defines the setting architecture acts from, the world like it is. The second motivates our interventions into this perceived setting. Thanks. It deals with the world like it could or should be. And the third describes the field of action architecture is in its best sense an integral part of. And vice versa, the desires and practices are structured, produced, and limited by the forces of social actualities, as are our design intentions and our options to act. And again, turned around, the actualities come across us in our actions and desires. They are perceived in the momentum when they connect with the everyday. Changed actualities and conditions produce new desires, intentions, and actions, as do different actors with different practices and values make us perceive facts differently. So I just wanted to show that to get an idea about reality and to separate for a moment 3 not separatable dimensions of reality, actualities, desires, and practices, each of them very hard to explore, very hard to grasp, and with the idea that they are interconnected and, for example, different practices relate to actualities and desires and produce new actualities and desires, that this is a very complicated setting. But that's the setting that architecture, as a design-oriented discipline, or even any other kind of design, has to deal with. So this is a dilemma, and I will try to explain the dilemma a little bit more in detail. The dualistic relation between facts and values, or as I named it, between actualities and desires, were defined by design methodologist and mathematic Horst Rittel, who taught in Berkeley and at the HFG Ulm before that. This relation between facts and values was defined by him in the early 70s as a problem, as a design problem in general. He called those problems wicked problems, because we know so little about their structure and because it is, as a matter of principle, unlikely to find well-fitting solutions to them. That was his argumentation. So a design problem, defined as the relation between actualities and desires only, is definitively not solvable. If we add the dimension of practice, what I tried to do in the beginning, to that dialectic model, it makes things even worse. We have no reliable knowledge about the vague actualities, no idea about real desires, and less than marginal impact on the heterogeneous activities that take place and transform space day by day. Especially, we can't rely on actualities, desires, and practices, since they do not offer a homogeneous and stable framework. They are contradictory in themselves and tend to change quickly in relation to each other. The risk of architecture with a problem-solving attitude to produce new problems and negative side effects, or just dislocate the problems in another field, is quite high if it ignores these difficulties. But do we have any other option than to deal with these three kinds of reality to get in touch with a design problem? And then, how do we relate to these social actualities, social realities, the everydayness, and the individual and collective needs? Now, there's not an answer coming, but something different. Well, maybe it's an answer. First, maybe that's only first. First, we have to accept the underlying dynamic and incomprehensible conflict between actualities, desires, and practices. We have to accept that architecture, planning, and design are not able to produce any homogenizing, settling, durable, optimal, or even just satisfying solutions. Architecture is not able to solve problems, also spatial problems, produced by a political and social misrelation of desires, practices, and actualities. But maybe a quite more interesting dimension of design is its potential to articulate and transform these conflicts. It is about a spatial negotiation of the discourses of reality. This concerns politics as well as the everyday. Both can be defined as complex transitions from desires to actualities through practices. They both, politics and the everyday, individually or collectively negotiate and produce these conflicting fields of reality. And in contradiction to my sympathy to define architecture as a problem-oriented practice in the beginning, this dilemma of reality keeps us from thinking in solution, which was, of course, the modernist impetus towards these issues, which failed, at least in some ways. So what I mean is that architecture constitutes a mean of negotiation rather than a solution in itself. It can be understood as a cultural method to spatially negotiate power structures and social relation. But this can only be done productively if architecture learns to accept conflicts as a productive force in the urban environment and to appreciate buildings as points of intersection for contradictory discourses on reality. In that sense, design is never intended as a means to produce any ultimate solution. It is rather understood as a detailed articulation of a problem that opens space for a collective process of negotiation. So now I want to switch to some works that we did in the last years and present it structured by 12 working theses ifau and me produced in the last month and years. The problem is that the projects do not fit very well to these theses, and these theses do not set up a kind of canon that is in itself well structured. It's more that we set up some arguments to criticize our own work or to have a kind of a structure that we can rely on, or even only to reflect about the projects we did before and afterwards. But the main argument in these theses and also behind some of the projects is has to do with the last sentence I read right now, that design is never intended as a means to produce any ultimate solution. It is rather understood as a detailed articulation of a problem that opens space for a collective process of negotiation. So thesis 1 is very close to that text. Non-solution. Do not try to solve social problems using architectural means. So it's not about relativating the necessity to deal with social realities, with social problems or issues. It's more about not overestimating the potential of design in any kind to be able to really solve social, political issues. It's more to find a relation towards these issues and then to, let's say, re-articulate these issues. As I said, the projects have in the end little to do with these theses, but I try to focus on it. So a project we did in New York for the Goethe Institute, they were forced to leave the main building in Fifth Avenue and to move temporarily their bibliothèque and their office working areas into a loft building. And we were invited, after doing several projects for them, to redesign this loft space. You see the big floor plan. The problem was, like always, that they had no budget for it, and that we have done a workshop before with all the stuff about their working relations and about the conditions in the building they have at Fifth Avenue. And so we found out that there are some problems in this institution. So the public who enters to the bibliothèque has no relation to the cultural program that the institution is doing in this building. And on the other hand, the working routines are very separated from each other, and all these kind of separate departments of the institute have more or less no contact. We couldn't solve that problem in the workshops and in the proposals we did, so we tried to re-articulate them in the new setting, and the only thing we could do was to arrange the shelves from the bibliothèque, the tables and all these things that they have, and to convince them that they can use the space differently. And the main thing was that we put the bibliothèque in the center of this vast space and suggested to have the kitchen, a conference room, working place, the place to store stuff in this bibliothèque, and not to separate between office and bibliothèque. And then we helped with some details, and that is how it looks today. So there you see this kitchen. This is, don't know if it's bibliothèque or office, maybe something in between. And what we else did, but it was more something that we tried to emphasize this kind of unsharp situations by doing such kind of very big wall prints together with Manuel Reder, where we use photographs from the other building spaces Goethe Institute uses in New York. And this is a building, the Wyoming building we designed on this wall, to bring in also this kind of public appearance in New York in this space where the bibliothèque, the public zones of Goethe Institute mixes up with the working area. This is the kitchen inside of the bibliothèque. The kitchen was already there. We just brought in a new shelf and a new lamp and some chairs. Second, accessibility. Be generous to public space. So this is a very simple thesis, and but something that is more kind of reminder. This is the second project we did for the Goethe Institute in New York, or let's say the before this office bibliothèque thing. It's called the Wyoming building. The Goethe Institute decided to, also because of the renovation and the fire security problems of the main building, to have a space for seminars, public presentations, lectures, workshops and exhibitions at the Lower East Side. And it's a very narrow and deep shop facing here the street and the backyard. And they asked us to design a kind of a visible dimension of the cultural program of the Goethe Institute. But they were not really sure about what to do there: seminars, teaching languages, exhibitions, lectures, etc. And so we decided to make the space quite complicated and separate it in a few zones which offer different kinds of settings. This entrance zone, this corridor zone with the toilet, and this kind of ring for gatherings, but also for the office, you can see here. But one thing that we implemented was a very narrow space facing the street. This is a street facade, and a column, a steel column, which has no reason, technical reason there. Because the idea was to give the Goethe Institute a space that is very narrow, very condensed, has no specific function, but allows on a very low level to invite guests to do a kind of exhibition, to use the space for a gathering or for as an office, without having to open the whole institution to this semi-public or informal element. So this column was very important to have a kind of first element that allows to fix a horse or a dog to it, or a mountain bike, or some stickers, or some tape like here, or a flag, or whatever. We felt necessity to have something outside without changing the facade or anything of the building. And this is this first very narrow space. You can close the door, so then it's really physically separated from the rest of the institution, but you can also use it as a wardrobe. And you have kind of a kitchen here, which can use as a bar. And yeah, there was the idea to have a space that allows, in practical terms, a kind of being public at a very simple level without occupying the whole institutional dynamic to open and to bring away the computers and all these things. And this is in the backspace, this ring, which is quite problematic for people to sit in or to work there, but it has the positive effect that there is also electricity running through that ring, and then you have at least the chance to plug your laptop or your printing machine to it. 3, informalism. Do not design things that you don't have to. And this is very important. In the end, the idea behind it is also to not have too much work in the office and not to design things that are really not necessarily have to design. But in the end, you never know that this is a good idea. This is a project for Artist Space. Stefan Kalmar in New York asked us, after collaborating in Kunstverein München with him, to do a redesign for the Artist Space in Manhattan. And he liked, what was the thesis? Sorry, do not design things, don't have to. The relation is very vague. He asked us to do something new, to clean up the little bit messed up institution and to reopen this loft space, which is not visible in that picture, but was there imaginable. Because his main aim was to have several kinds of formats between exhibitions, dinners, bookshop, office work, but also informal meetings of artists, etc. And he said he needs a lot of kind of constellations for this, and he wanted to have a flexible system providing these potentials. And we had the feeling that going closer into the issue that wouldn't make that much sense, and we suggested to build up 8 spaces, a kind of cabinet system, which have similar size but different light and access conditions. And we argued it's much easier to have these 8 spaces, and if you move the office or the bibliothek or an artist or whatever, they can just move and you just have to provide access to that space, and it's much more easier and even maybe looks better than this kind of loft with a movable wall, etc. And the problem was to organize the accessibility, and we invented a lot of doors here connecting all these spaces, and where you can move almost from anywhere to anywhere. He liked this kind of starting point to think a little bit, but we also found out that the budget was too small for all these walls, and then we suggested to forget about the walls, because walls usually come with exhibitions, etc., or with shelves that you have, and just to build this kind of interconnection parts of these 8 rooms, because the doors are most complicated to build. If you have the doors, then it's easy to put a shelf beneath it, and you can guarantee the accessibility of these 8 spaces. This was also a little bit too expensive, and then we just built the substructure of these walls in certain parts, and here you see this. This is a kind of balloon frame structure. We said if you don't have money for the walls, use it for shelves, and these are 2 of the doors, for example, that interconnect these spaces. Here's another door in between. Yeah, and we designed this kind of metal elements and some display systems and this bench here for him. He wanted to have some designed objects in it. 4, caring proportion. This is very romantic. A spatial dimension. Caring means, don't know if it's the right word, means social proportions probably. A spatial dimension is a social relation, what every architect knows but nobody really believes in. Maybe, for example, also this kind of balloon frame, semi-wall-less artist space has to do with something which you can handle. For example, you can bring in a shelf, you can bring in a wooden panel which is not too heavy. This is more what I mean with social, that you can handle it, or maybe this kind of, not in the sense of this ring that has, of course, a social dimension, but more a symbolic dimension. But this is completely wrong now. It has nothing to do with caring proportions. It's really out of proportion. It has more to do with social relations and negotiations, but maybe we come to that later. So we were asked by a friend from ifau, Christoph, learned to know at a bar, and he's a printer. He's running a very big professional printing company in Berlin. Professional more in terms of machines and only. Forget about it. And he bought a piece of land in Berlin, Schöneberg, and wanted to locate all his Heidelberg printing machines, these very big ones you see here, 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 and over there, and all that you need. And the problem was that one of his customers, customers and also a little bit friend, was a person who just professionally building this industrialized buildings. He's a general constructor who's usually able to do this without any interference of architects or any other design people. But I don't know, he asked us to help him with that thing, and maybe there were only 2 things we could do: to intervene in the beginning in the overall setting, and in the end with the details, and that was what we did. So what the constructor proposed was quite usual, a kind of a big industrialized production hall for all the machines, and a 2-story brick or concrete building for the offices, for showers, for graphic designers, for the showroom, etc. on this site. And we found that not very sensible in terms of the internal relation of the company, and also the very family-like organized structure of this small company. And we had the feeling it would be better to have only 1 building. And so we suggested to use the whole lot, which is limited here and here, for the building, and build this cheapest possible building on that place. And then to put in the corner, very stupidly, more kind of fixed elements for office secretary, for some printing, preparing parts, for the graphic designers, for the kitchen, for the toilets, for the showers, for all that stuff that the people need. And not to have a showroom, and that people enter through a very marginal door directly in that place. This was the kind of diagram we did in of the working and printing relations that this company uses. And this is a model of the roof shape, because we were forced to use a kind of standardized roof shape which is the most economic. Also supermarkets use that in Germany because snow goes down, but it's not too steep to produce any other problems. But if we would have done it only with 1 roof, it would have been a very high building, consuming much of energy to heat it, etc. So we had to do this kind of folded roof, you see inside. And And these are, here you see these kind of compartments for office, printing workshop, built very stupidly in the corners. And in the end, we just had to go there time to time and force this kind of money-saving, very professional company to make details and finishings much more lower than they wanted to have it, and to have the materials getting together in very simple and stupid ways. And yeah, and it's interesting that it's hard to bring in all that stuff in that, or it's not hard, it's quite funny, but that it's quite, let's say, complicated interior now with all these machines, people, stuff in it, even so that it's a very big and simple overall structure. 5, suboptimum. Maybe it has more to do with suboptimum than with the issue of caring proportions. So, suboptimum. Undergo functional demands to open unexpected possibilities. A project for, just one deck, okay. Project for Künstlerhaus Stuttgart, curated or run by Axel John Wieder, a close friend of mine. He asked us, even since he knew that we wouldn't do that, to produce a kind of architectural CI. He didn't use that word, but he wanted to have a kind of representative visual concept for the building. It exists, there are offices, exhibition spaces, lecture spaces, studios, workshop spaces. And but in the end, we just rearranged the furniture, the people, the use of spaces, and worked more or less like a kind of a housekeeper. We made lists of what to bring where, what to draw in which color, what to remove. The process still going on, even after the curator left the institution and a new curator is there. And just one thing I want to focus on in relation to the thesis of suboptimum was the task to design a bar. Maybe this was the point where Axel really insisted of doing something design-wise. And there was a bar already designed by students a few years ago, which was quite nice, but a little bit run down. And we just had no idea to do a better bar there. But then we found out that there's space behind the bar where they store the drinks, where they have the fridge and a kind of a sink. And then we had the idea just to cut the door of this space, bring in 2 boards, and that could be a very nice bar without doing a bar. And then we just added this bench and put away some of these glass elements to have a kind of showcase for schnapps. At this, you heard about the schnapps problem already?
We have our own schnapps problem.
Yeah, and then you can open the door. Yeah, it's the same schnapps. Yeah. And that works quite well because we didn't design the bar, just cut the door. It was a little bit strange at the opening that people who were keen to see the bar didn't see them. 6, robustness. Is that word existing in English, or is it? It's a nice word. Tough spaces are better able to stand social interactions. So that means make it robust. This is a project that did together with Kooperative Darstellungspolitik. We specialized on exhibition design. And we were asked for the Kunsthaus Bregenz to do a kind of installation for a series of performances of artists to come. It's a building by, not Zumthor, is it Zumthor? Kunsthaus Bregenz? It's Zumthor. So you know what I mean? No touch. And we tried to find out about the artists' interest, performances, some of them we knew already, but probably didn't make that much sense to build something that they could use or not use because they didn't know exactly, and our experience was that if you produce something, it will be not used or misused or whatever, which is okay. So we suggested a series of steel elements, very robust. 5 meters, the biggest one, and height of 3 meters. You can move below, and they get lower and lower. The lowest you can sit on, the highest you can hang on, and the one is fixed to the wall. and the others you can, if you're really strong or 3 or 4 people, move a little bit around it so you can make it smaller or bigger. And in the beginning we just put in some, and there's also a pink, purple, no, lila, lilac one, 3, purple. And the idea was to bring in something robust that doesn't make that much sense for the artists or the performances, but probably they can use it for a screen or separating an area. And I don't have a picture of this, how it was used, but it worked for some of the artists. And it's quite nice because we got it back now to Berlin, these elements, and Ruth Buchanan, who did the first exhibition there, uses it for an exhibition now in Netherlands, and we get it back again, and I can use it for our garden probably, because it's really tough. Conflict design, maybe it had also to do with conflict design. It has to do with the theses of not solving problems, but re-articulating them, like all the theses. It says, produce obstacles to interrupt normative routines. It's always surprising which projects comes, but this is very close to the issue. It was the first project ifau and me did together, a competition for the KW Institute in Berlin. We lost, second prize, not bad. There was a budget to propose a design solution for an entrance. Maybe you know this institution. In the backyard there is an exhibition space and a cafeteria, and it is in the middle of Berlin, Auguststraße. Yeah, it's an entrance like you know them. And especially there's a sign, a flag, and you enter a living area, an atelier here. And the idea was to have a more, let's say, simple representative entrance, which we found not very useful for that institution. And we suggested to bring in a cage here with 4 doors, a smaller one and a bigger one. The one is maybe more private or could be more private, and the one is closable, just to make it more complicated to enter this space of cultural logic, this space of leisure or inspiration, or for vernissage where you meet these people. So for an exhibition you have to have some preconditions, and we thought it quite interesting to have it to mark this kind of border of the cultural institution more explicit. And practically we had the idea that this could be a useful space for the wardrobe, for a VIP entrance, for security staff, for storing rubbish or parts of installations, but also for visitors come home, they have their space secured. So it was a mixture between a practical and a complicating device. And we had some money left because it was so cheap to, would have been so cheap to do it. And we said, okay, we can have this money to maybe install a kind of curatorial program for this space or whatever. So that means not design too much, and if you have some money left for other things, that's also quite a positive effect of architecture. 8. So it's 12, it's only 4 more. Spaces of negotiation. That's quite similar to the last one. Create situations for conflicts to be negotiated by the users. This was until now our biggest project. We won a competition in Graz in Austria for the redesign of a former Baroque palais for 4 institutions, or for 3 institutions, a museum, office, the Landesmuseum, who deals with the heritage of the region, the House of Architecture, an architecture museum, quite famous one, and the Kunstverein Graz, that building. The problem was that in the brief, the problem was that the building was under national heritage and you couldn't change anything to it, and that the institution wanted more space for their exhibition office areas than the building had. So the only opportunity was to build a very massive basement to bring all that kind of stuff in there, which we found a little bit strange, to build that small Baroque palais with a basement, and even not interesting towards this kind of institutions. So we came up with the idea that they should share spaces. That, for example, a bar, a toilet, of course, a conference space, even exhibitions space, even office space, but also kind of this kind of entrance, or let's say infrastructural spaces like staircase could be shared or double used. And this is what these diagrams are about. I don't understand them. anymore, but this is the space existing, and this is the space they wanted, and we combined all these kind of programs like kitchen, toilet, exhibition space, office, storage, and by overlapping some of them, combining them, we managed to bring that volume into that volume, which caused some problems which are not solved until today. Kunstverein moved out of it, but more for financial reasons. And one of these things was that we had the idea to bring these institutions together in a quite conflictuous way, to negotiate how they use the building, and to have only one entrance for the building. And there was a kind of historical big entrance, and we opened it at the end and made a kind of passage to it, which leads in the end to the toilets. You can only enter from the outside. What we usually do, that we make toilets only accessible from the outside, which is quite relaxing sometimes. And this passage is the entrance for all the institutions, but at the same time, exhibition space for the House of Architecture. So this is where we could, for example, save, let's say, 50 square meters. And we blocked, which is not all visible, the windows of this ground floor to really make it necessary to enter the building physically. Here are some people with bicycles. And we invented a fourth institution, a bar at the end of this passage, because we found it necessary to have this space always open and always accessible, also at night. And so this passage is not only used as entrance to all institutions and as exhibition space, but also as a bar and also the private kitchen of the institutions. This is this passage. Of course, we have a moving wall system to separate office, etc. of that building. Don't know about the thesis anymore. This is the Showroom project in London. Emily Pethick, after working with her for Casco in Utrecht, asked us to help her to redesign the spatial social structures of this institution, which moved into that new warehouse or car repairing, whatever it was. Airplane? Okay. And maybe two things. One was interesting was that in the end she asked about which color should she give to the facade. We changed a little bit here the lamps and this thing here, and this we brought in a new garage door that brings in some light in this exhibition space. And it was hard to decide about a color. There are many nice colors we like. And then we had a closer look at the building, and we found what was apparent from the beginning, that the other buildings, or the other parts of the building, 4 of them over there, they all have divided colors. It's brown and white, or blue and white, or green and whatever. And we thought, why are these buildings, with no reason, from the technical reason, why are they divided in 2 colors? And then I found out the solution. It has to do with a ladder somebody uses to paint the building. So if a car crashes in, someone does a graffiti or dogs or whatever, then the building gets dirtied after a certain time. And it's much easier to paint a certain area where you can use a ladder and a person and a brush or whatever, and to repaint it there. And they repainted it in what color they liked. Maybe even the new shop is in there. And the upper part is quite complicated. You need something to get there, so you paint it white because it will not be dirty that much. So and that was more about the colors, maybe a social proportion, that we just had to suggest to use this kind of 2 colors. And then she decided for yellow. And so the logo type was also on that part, because you could repaint it or redesign it easier than if it would have been on the upper part of the building. And on interior, since the budget was tight after we had to install an elevator for an access to the 2nd floor, we wanted to keep all the radiation systems who have been on that wall, because there was a floor and all the cable, electricity. We just built a kind of substructure for a wall there to be able to keep all the technical stuff, and because we also felt that the first exhibition, or the second at least, would bring in some wall panels, and then we don't need to do a white cube from the beginning. So that's how it looks here, and there's the elevator now. But the funding for that came later, so we had only to prepare the hole and the cabin for this elevator. This was the first exhibition in there, where you already see there was a kind of wall in parts of it here. 9, appropriation detailing. Facilitating adaptations and modifications, which is important to a building, is a practical design task. More in terms of robustness or in social or in caring proportions than in flexibility. So the first project we did with Emily Pethick was in Casco. She also moved to another space and asked us to do a proposal for her new office. We found out together with her that this was not really necessary, because in the old place they had the office. They moved the office each exhibition they did. The office was part of the exhibition. They did workshops, lectures in the office. They rearranged it according to what kind of space was necessary. And we liked this very much and said this is not necessary, but if you want us to do anything, we can build in something that makes the space a little bit more appropriate for an office or a kitchen, and a little bit more dimensional in terms of possible ideas for exhibitions. And we built in this, we called it a kind of a shack, and this is a kind of a fence. In the beginning it was yellow, and there was a kind of shelf system and a kitchen in the beginning, but we didn't know what it was really useful for, but it was very rough detailing. We call it more of social democratic detailing, you know, from bibliotheques or kindergarten or school. They can bear more than they are built for, and they are easy to deal with. The wood you can drill in, you can repaint it, and it's a very simple connecting system, you see here. And in the beginning it worked very well to mount a PA system and to bring the cables out of the walking area. And I show a series of exhibitions that have been done there without commenting too much, that shows how several artists or projects deal with it. So the first one, the difference between our structure and the exhibition is quite invisible. This is an exhibition SAG curated there. It was used as a display structure. Here more or less not used. Made a kind of video box out of it. So the dimensions have to do with the tables of the office they use. They have to do with formats you get, very simple and cheap, of screens or of wall panels, also the things you can handle or care. The height has to do with the idea of mount something, etc. But then it was coming new curator, and she asked for the color, and I said green would be nice. Peter Haven taped it. Miriam, so then in the meanwhile the structure was gray, and Miriam doubled it with a black structure, who even extended through the facade on the street. Martha Rosler exhibition, it was more kind of a purple. We used it as an archive, storage space. And the last exhibition I have pictures from is this, where the roof is used as a kind of floor, and a stair was added. 10, surplus and deficit. We also had this in the Teenfeld with the overlying of functions and this dance program. More space is better than less space. Sometimes it's the other way around. The brief is always wrong. Competition we won, but in the end we lost the project for Tanzraum Berlin, where several dancing companies, performance studios, university departments for dance and performance, and institutions wanted to have a building where they have training space, but also performance space, but also bibliothèque, meeting, office, etc. And they also had a program that was quite perfectly fitting to the space. There was nothing left, nothing left over, and everything worked. And we had the feeling it doesn't make much sense with an institution that builds on the idea of communication, of dance, on meeting with the public, to have this kind of rigid program implemented in the space. So we made it even more rigid on the first floor. We packed all the studio space on the first floor and only left over the minimum necessary emergency exit corridors without any light, but managed to bring in all the studios up there. And so we had spatial resources on the ground floor where we just suggested some partitions for walls, etc. But the other effect was that we had necessarily to implement a few staircases that give access to the spaces, and they all openly enter to the ground floor. This has, for example, the effect that if someone goes to the shower or to the toilet or has to dress up or dress down for this training thing, he goes through the public area. And this enforces a kind of communication or physical contact where the studio spaces are connected, but in a very practical, social or personal way. And this was the idea, to turn the brief around and to make it more dense and more open to allow this kind of programmatic the institution wanted to have. Minimum. The feeling I have a thesis very close to that. But once more, very important, minimize design activities to enable programmatic interventions. Yeah, it has to do with the idea of not designing things, not necessarily, also to save work, design work, which didn't work in the Haus der Kulturen. Asked to do the event design for 3 days filming, discussions, exhibitions, event at the Haus der Kulturen in Berlin Tiergarten called Documentary Forum, focused on documentary practices in art, movie, literature. We had the idea to move to this kind of, you probably know it, this kind of shell-like space, and to do nothing in architectural terms, but to restructure the space to allow certain social or performative situations to happen that are not fixed, this is the space, to this main focus of the stage, the screen, and the overall audience, where it is quite boring when only 10 people or 12 come in the morning. And so we invented a series of situations, changing the stage, the light, the chairs, the screens, and all these things, which mainly had to do with the technicians in the building, which we had to reorient how they install the technique of these events, which was extremely complicated and time-consuming because we didn't have our own tools to bring in material and design it. We had to deal with all this kind of bureaucratic elements of how the space usually works. And here you see this main screen, second screen, a new stage, an extension of the space, removal of chairs, second screen, archive. We implemented more ephemeral structures that allowed to use the space differently and also provide access to the roof to become a more socially bearable space. It was a very nice event and it looked strange, but I think it worked in terms of how this kind of 3 days conference had a social dense atmosphere. Maybe the last project before the last thesis is Kunstverein München, where we, among other small things, asked to redesign the entrance area, who was also by Stefan Kalmar programmed for many diverse events, things to happen between bar, bookshop, etc. And we just designed a very huge table placed in the middle of the space. So it could be used as a bar, but there was only a sink from us close to the wall, but it was too distant to be really a bar with a front and a back side. And we had the idea that this could work very well for all the things he had in mind without in detail articulating these situations. This was one of our first projects, and it was really funny that we had at least 2 times strengthened the table because it broke down several times because they used it for fashion shows as a catwalk and concerts, but also for lectures, discussions, office work, for the bar, of course, for the cashier, for the entrance. And I think it's still there. In this perspective, not to do that much in the space, it was a quite strong intervention. The last thesis is quite new. It has to do with the project we are working on at the moment. It's called Standard. The common and the ordinary allow for inclusivity. And it is focused on collective housing projects we are planning at the moment, and we start to build in June or July this year for with 20 flats in Berlin-Kreuzberg. And without going into details of that project, it's a reproduction of a feature explaining the project at the stadium that is quite before buying the piece of land where it will be built on. But the design project is together with 20 parties, families, couples or whatever who will later own and live in that building. And we used the idea of standardization to set up a kind of collaborative design process that enables us to get closer to two aims the project has. The one is to build a very, very cheap building fitting to the building regulations in Berlin, because all of them, and I also live in that building, cannot afford a usual building, like expensive as it is today. And the other is to have a collective building with a big collective dimension, shared spaces, but also a kind of collectivity in its approach, in contradiction to that individualization that a flat owner or a house owner usually looks forward. And so it had a lot to do with a standardized design process, like we know from social housing projects, where we try to say one type of a kitchen, one type of a facade. How can we go to that together with the group to come to kind of ordinary, inclusive standards that help us to reduce costs and planning and building efforts? So we started with the group with kind of diagrammatic mode to develop their floor plans, or not their floor plans, maybe their idea of living, what they need, what they don't need, and are now in the midst of a kind of working process where we develop these apartments in that building. This is the building, by the way, how it will look like. We have a common outside area, 80 centimeters, surpassing all the facade, with the possibility to enter from each room the outside area with no balcony. But it's also a collective part of the building, which gives you a second access to the flat. And the flats are quite simple in its basic layout. So these are the common spaces, a big common space in the lower area, the kind of infrastructure, these balcony zones and the roof terrace, and also a very big garden we share. And this is the other things where we try to talk about standards, more about a standardization of a process of communication. Like also with these graph diagrams at the beginning, we developed methods of communication that go beyond brainstorming or discussions to formalize, to standardize, to objectivize certain situations, not with the aim to develop design solutions out of them, but to bring in a kind of objectivation in certain moments to allow us and the group to discuss specific points. And this was a kind of an outcome of a decision about the functions and the volumes and the organizational systems for the collective spaces that were wanted in the beginning. And we used them to evaluate these proportions. And we used them also in this process which is shown here, where we step by step developed spatial but also functional models, how a collective, a common general space could look like and where it could be located, and how it could affect the overall building. And in the end we came to the solution to just provide a kind of non-structured space with 2 stories, with 3 doors and an exit entrance to the street. And we have a budget now in the project that is allows the group to at a later moment to build in something in that space that makes it to work for kids, a yoga, a bar, a kitchen, workshop space, etc. So that was a brief about that project, and the idea to deal in a quite problematic relation to that issue of building a home for one's own, with the idea of standardization, with a specific standardization that enables a group to act as a group, but also to aim at a very cheap and pragmatic building. Yeah. Thanks a lot for your patience.
Thank you very much. I'm just mindful of time, so in a few moments we can have first questions, and then in a few moments in the room adjoining we'll have drinks and very kind of informal presentation by Matthias and the presentation of the new book. But first, do we have any questions from the floor? Perhaps I can start with one. A lot of the projects you presented are perhaps more about structuring than providing kind of design solutions, and the talk was also structured in quite a unique way. And I was kind of wondering to what extent these theses you presented were actually a kind of argument for the project, or rather a kind of retrospective rationalization?
They were completely retrospective rationalizations, which is very important at some moments, and this was also interesting with this, doing this kind of small magazine on the project, that at a certain moment of a project, whatever project it is, I think it's very important to have a kind of necessity to formulate or reformulate the beginnings of a project, the idea of a project, also the pragmatic changes it did. And these theses in the end were put over the projects, and they had not to do as much with the idea of the beginning of a project, but it helped us to find out what points were important to us, and also which points did we manage to get through this kind of negotiation process of a project, at least at some moments, and to rethink the potentiality of that or the limitation of that. So it's more a kind of reflective process that comes between the two projects.
Any questions? Shall we perhaps then have a kind of more informal atmosphere, so we can go next door and continue the conversation and questions there? Thank you very much. Unless you have a question. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.